Private Ethan Miller had been stationed overseas for 2 long years, and the countdown to his return had felt endless. The daily routine of training, missions, and living in a foreign country had taken its toll. But now, just a few days ahead of schedule, Ethan was on his way home. His heart raced as the plane descended toward his hometown. The excitement of finally being back was almost overwhelming, yet mixed with it was a hint of nervousness. There was so much he hadn't thought about until now, especially one person. Sarah. Sarah had been his best friend for as long as he could remember. They'd grown up together, shared everything from childhood secrets to teenage dreams. She had always been there for him, supporting him through the toughest of times. But over the past few years, something had changed. The lines between friendship and something deeper had blurred in a way that Ethan could never quite explain. When he left for the military, it had been with the unspoken understanding that there was something more between them, though neither of them had ever said it out loud. Ethan had spent countless nights lying in his bunk, thinking about her. He remembered the way her laugh made him feel at home, the way her eyes lit up whenever they talked about the future. Those moments stayed with him through every dark day, keeping him going. But he never got the chance to tell her how much she meant to him. He thought about how their friendship could have turned into something more, but now it seemed almost too late. He'd been gone for so long, who knew what had changed while he was away? He couldn't stop thinking about the surprise he was planning. Ethan couldn't wait to see her again, to hold her close, and maybe, just maybe, see if there was a chance to explore the feelings that had always lingered beneath the surface. With each step that brought him closer to home, his heart thudded faster. Would Sarah be happy to see him? Would she feel the same way he did? He hoped so, but there was no way of knowing for sure. As the cab pulled into his neighborhood, Ethan couldn't help but smile. He was finally home. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he stepped out of the cab and made his way up the familiar street. His feet knew the path to Sarah's house better than his own thoughts did at that moment. It had been years since he'd seen her, but it felt like it hadn't been that long at all. The neighborhood looked much the same, the trees lining the sidewalks and the houses standing proudly in the dusk light. But as he neared Sarah's house, something felt different. The warm, inviting glow of the front porch light wasn't there. Instead, the windows were closed, and a heavy silence hung in the air. The flowers Sarah used to tend to so lovingly were withered, as though no one had cared for them in months. It was subtle, but there was a distinct shift, something Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on. His stomach tightened with unease. Sarah's house had always been a place of comfort for him, a place where he could always count on a smile, an open door, and an embrace that felt like home. But tonight, it felt distant, unfamiliar. He took a deep breath, pushed the knot of nerves in his chest away, and rang the doorbell, his hand shaking just slightly. He waited for a moment, feeling both excitement and dread swirl inside him. But when the door opened, it wasn't Sarah who stood there. A man, much taller than Ethan, with a calm but surprised expression, stood in the doorway. He had dark hair and a serious look about him. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice friendly but guarded. Ethan blinked, taken aback. I'm looking for Sarah Miller," he said, still trying to process the confusion rising inside him. The man's face softened slightly, but his posture remained tense. "I'm her husband, Daniel," he replied. The world around Ethan seemed to freeze. His breath caught in his throat as the words sank in. Her husband? Daniel must have seen the shock in Ethan's face because he quickly stepped back. "Is everything okay?" he asked, though it was clear he was just as puzzled by Ethan's reaction. Ethan stood there, speechless, his mind racing. Sarah, his Sarah, had been married for a year now? How had he missed that? The days and weeks that had passed without a single word from her suddenly felt like they weighed a ton, crushing him with the realization that all his hopes for a reunion had been shattered in an instant. Confusion, hurt, and disbelief flooded his chest. He hadn't known. How could he not know? He had spent 2 years thinking about her, dreaming of this moment. And now, here he was, standing on her doorstep, a stranger to the life she had built without him. Daniel's voice broke through his thoughts. "I'm sorry, man, I didn't know." He trailed off, unsure how to explain the awkwardness of the situation. Ethan just nodded, unable to find the words. His legs felt like lead as he turned away, leaving the man standing there, his mind spinning with questions he couldn't answer. Ethan wandered aimlessly through the quiet streets, his mind a storm of confusion and hurt. He needed to clear his head, but the more he thought about what had just happened, the more he felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He couldn't even remember how he ended up at the small cafe down the block, its warm lights offering a brief sense of refuge from the whirlwind in his chest. He sat at a corner table, staring at the untouched coffee in front of him. The steam curled upward in the dim light, but he couldn't bring himself to drink it. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah, to the memories they had shared. His heart ached at the thought of her, the girl he had known his whole life. He remembered the first time they met, how they had both been so shy as children, yet instantly connected. He'd been the quiet boy with a love for books, and she was the adventurous spirit who dragged him out of his comfort zone, teaching him how to climb trees and skip stones across the creek. The laughter they shared was so simple, so pure. And as they grew older, those moments continued to build. There were nights spent talking until the stars faded, dreaming about the future. In those moments, Ethan had always believed that their friendship was unshakable. Maybe even something more, though he never had the courage to voice it. The feeling of betrayal hit him like a wave. He could still hear Sarah's laughter in his ears, could still feel the warmth of her hand in his when they had walked side by side down familiar paths. How had everything changed so drastically while he had been gone? How had she moved on without him? But as much as the hurt stung, there was a nagging feeling deep inside him. Something didn't add up. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she reached out even once after all these years? The pain twisted into something deeper. Uncertainty. Ethan wasn't ready to leave it like this. He needed answers. So after what felt like hours of deliberating, he finally pulled himself together. He had to see Sarah. He needed to know the truth. That evening, he stood in front of Sarah's house again, his nerves still raw. The door opened, and she was there, standing in front of him. The woman who had once been the center of his world now seemed so distant, so fragile. She avoided his gaze, her eyes focused on the ground, and a heavy silence hung between them. "Ethan," she said softly, almost apologetically, "I didn't expect you to be back so soon." The words felt like daggers to his heart. "I wasn't expecting this either," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I didn't know." She winced, and he saw her bite her lip, trying to hold back whatever emotions were bubbling beneath the surface. She stepped aside, silently inviting him in, but neither of them moved. The air between them felt thick, charged with unspoken tension. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice trembling. I've been hiding something, Ethan, something I should have told you a long time ago." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "What do you mean?" His voice was barely a whisper. She took a deep breath, her eyes still avoiding his. "I married Daniel. We got married because he was deployed, and I didn't want to wait forever. I thought maybe it was time to move on with my life. But I never stopped caring about you, Ethan. I couldn't just forget everything we had, everything we were supposed to be. I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd come home and tell me how you felt, and if you did, I would have made a choice. But you never did, and I just kept waiting." The words hit Ethan like a thunderclap. The reality of what she had said crashing down on him. She had waited for him, just as he had secretly waited for her. But she had also moved on in the way she thought was best, uncertain whether he would ever come back, unsure if he felt the same. Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, guilt, sorrow, and a deep ache for the time they had lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "I didn't want to burden you," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't want to make things harder for you, especially when you were away. I didn't know what would happen. But when you left, I thought we had time. Time to figure it out. But then, it was just too late." Ethan stood frozen, the weight of the years lost between them pressing on his chest. There was so much to process, so much he still didn't understand. But for the first time in so long, it felt like they were finally saying the words that had been locked inside them for all this time. Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch swing, the soft creaking of the wood beneath them, the only sound breaking the stillness of the evening. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. The house around them, once a symbol of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a distant place. It was as if time had both stopped and moved forward all at once. Neither of them knew what to say next, but there they were, side by side, facing the past they had both tried to leave behind. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting in his lap, the weight of everything he had kept hidden for so long. His love for Sarah, his guilt for not returning sooner, his fear of ruining the friendship they'd shared, was pressing down on him. He wanted to reach out, wanted to tell her how much he had always cared, but the words caught in his throat. "I don't know where to start," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. He could feel Sarah's presence beside him, her energy so close yet seemingly miles away. Sarah let out a long breath, her eyes staring ahead, avoiding his gaze. "I never wanted it to be like this, Ethan. You know that, right?" Her voice cracked slightly, the emotion in it raw and vulnerable. "But I couldn't keep waiting forever. I didn't know if you were ever coming back, and I should have told you how I felt," Ethan finished for her, his voice tight. He met her gaze for the first time, and in her eyes he saw the same pain, the same longing that had been haunting him for so long. "I never gave you that chance. I left, and I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't tell you what you meant to me." Sarah's face softened, the tension in her shoulders easing as she looked at him. "I was afraid too," she admitted, her voice quieter now, filled with a sadness that had been building inside her for years. "I was afraid you wouldn't come back. I couldn't just wait around forever, Ethan. I couldn't keep holding on to something that might never happen." Ethan felt his heart twist at her words. He had been so consumed by the idea of coming back to her, so sure that they would pick up right where they left off, that he hadn't even considered the possibility that she might have been waiting in the dark just as long as he had. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I did. I left without telling you how much I needed you." Sarah blinked back tears, her hand instinctively reaching out to touch his. "I wanted you to come home, Ethan. I wanted you to tell me everything, how much you cared, how you felt about me. But you never did, and I couldn't keep waiting, not when life was passing me by." Ethan's throat tightened and he fought back the lump that threatened to choke him. He had known that he had made mistakes in the past, but hearing Sarah's words brought them into sharp focus. "I never gave you a chance, Sarah. I was so wrapped up in the idea of going back to you that I didn't realize how much time had already passed." They both sat in silence, the weight of their unspoken feelings hanging between them like a tangible thing. The years, the distance, the silence, it all felt like too much to bear, yet in the quiet there was something else, a flicker of hope, of understanding. "I don't know what to do with all of this, Ethan," Sarah said softly, her voice strained. "I don't know if I'm ready to make a decision. Everything's so complicated now. Daniel, he's been here for me, and I can't just throw that away." Ethan nodded, the guilt gnawing at him. He understood. He could never ask her to choose him over her husband. But part of him still wished for something more, something he had never dared to voice before. "I get it," Ethan said quietly, looking down at his hands. "I don't want to complicate your life, Sarah. I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. And I'm sorry for waiting too long to tell you the truth." They sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of regret and unspoken love hanging in the air. Neither of them had answers. Neither of them knew what would come next. But in that moment, there was a sense of peace, too, because, for the first time, they had said the things they had both been too afraid to admit. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what either of them had imagined. But it was real. And for now, that was enough. The evening air grew thicker, the tension between Ethan and Sarah palpable as they sat together on the porch, the words they had shared lingering in the air. They were on the cusp of something, of finally confronting everything they had buried for so long. But before either of them could speak again, the sound of an engine humming down the street broke the silence. The familiar sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Ethan's heart race. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and she quickly turned her head, her face filled with an unmistakable panic. "Daniel," she whispered, as if to herself, before standing up quickly. Ethan's chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was supposed to be just him and Sarah, finally confronting the truth. He stood up too, unsure of what to do, feeling like an intruder in a situation he hadn't prepared for. Daniel stepped out of the car and looked up, his face lighting up in surprise when he saw Ethan standing on the porch. "Ethan, you're back early." His voice was casual, but the shock in his eyes was unmistakable. There was an awkward pause. Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Sarah, looking like a deer caught in headlights, shifted uncomfortably, trying to find the right words, but the silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Ethan glanced at Sarah, then took a deep breath. He knew it was time to be honest, completely honest. "Yeah," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "I'm home early, and Sarah and I, we have history. A bond, I guess you could say. I never meant to hurt anyone, Daniel, but I couldn't leave things unsaid. I care about her. I always have." The words felt heavy on his tongue, but they were true. Daniel's expression remained unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, as if processing what Ethan had just said. There was a brief pause, but then Daniel surprised both of them with a calmness that took them off guard. "I know," he said simply, his voice not angry, but resigned. Both Ethan and Sarah froze, unsure of how to respond. Daniel's gaze shifted from Sarah to Ethan, then back to Sarah with a gentle smile. "I've known for a while," Daniel continued. "I've been waiting, actually, waiting for Sarah to figure out what she wanted, if she was going to stay with me or follow her heart." Ethan felt his stomach drop. He hadn't expected this. It wasn't the reaction he'd imagined. Daniel wasn't angry, wasn't defensive. He was calm, almost understanding. "I don't want to complicate things, Sarah," Daniel said, his voice softening as he looked at her. "You need to follow your heart, whatever that is. If it's with me, then I'll respect that. If it's with Ethan, then I want you to be happy." He turned to Ethan and gave him a small knowing smile. "I'm not here to stop either of you." Ethan was stunned. Daniel's maturity, his understanding of the situation, left him speechless. It was more than Ethan had ever expected. The silence between the three of them felt less heavy now, but the weight of their emotions was still there, unspoken and raw. I don't know what to say," Sarah said quietly, the uncertainty in her voice still there. "I just need time." Daniel nodded and placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze gentle. "Take all the time you need, Sarah. Whatever you decide, I just want you to be happy. That's all." The air between them shifted, no longer full of tension, but still filled with so many unspoken emotions. Daniel's unexpected maturity had given both Ethan and Sarah the space they needed to breathe, but the path forward was still unclear. Sarah stood between them, the weight of her heart's decision heavy on her shoulders. The night fell silent around them, the air thick with unsaid words. Ethan and Sarah stood side by side, yet the space between them felt vast, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. There were no more words of anger or confusion, only the quiet understanding that something had changed. Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice softer than ever. "Ethan, I don't know what to do," she said, her eyes focused on the ground, as though the words themselves were too heavy to say aloud. "I have a lot of thinking to do." Ethan's heart clenched. He understood she needed time to sort through everything, the past, the present, and the future. And he couldn't ask her to make a decision in the heat of the moment, not when it involved so much of their history, their shared love, and their futures. He wanted to be the one who stood by her, who helped her figure it out. But he also knew that sometimes the hardest thing to do was step back and give someone the space they needed to find their own answers. "I get it," he said quietly, though the words felt like a weight lifting from his chest. "I can't make you choose right now, Sarah. I'm not asking you to. I need you to know how much I care about you. Always have." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to make this decision just because I'm afraid of losing either of you," she confessed, the vulnerability in her voice raw and honest. "I need to figure out what I really want. What will make me happy, what's right for me." Ethan nodded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. He knew this wasn't just about him. This was about Sarah finding her own path, something he couldn't walk for her. The pull he felt toward her was undeniable, but he had to respect her need for clarity. "I'll give you the space you need," Ethan said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, and for a moment the two of them stood in silence, the years of friendship, love, and regret hanging in the air between them. "Take your time, Sarah. I'll be here when you're ready." With that, he turned toward the driveway, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of it all. As he walked away, he didn't know what the future held. Whether they would find their way back to each other, or if Sarah would make a different choice. But there was a sense of peace within him. No matter what happened, no matter how long it took, he would never stop caring for her. And their bond, whatever form it took, would endure. He glanced back once more, catching her gaze as she stood on the porch, the dim light from the house casting a soft glow around her. Neither of them spoke, but in that moment, they both understood. There was hope. Thank you for watching this heartfelt journey of love, regret, and self-discovery. Ethan and Sarah's story shows how sometimes life's hardest decisions are the ones that bring us closer to understanding what truly matters. Will they find their way back to each other, or will they go their separate paths? Only time will tell, but their bond will always remain. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear what you think about the choices Sarah and Ethan made. And if you want to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time.